Buried under hay to suffocate in a locked loft, a cowboy heard her faint cough and gave her sky. The feed door had been nailed shut from the outside. I noticed it wrong before I even got close. There's a particular way a loft door hangs when it's just latched versus when someone's driven a 16-penny nail through the hasp. The angle's different. I'd been looking at barn doors my whole life, so I saw it the way you'd see your own hand holding something it shouldn't. That was a Thursday morning, early enough that the frost hadn't burned off the grass yet. My boots made that hollow crunch with each step across the yard, and the horses were restless in a way they get when something's in the barn that doesn't belong. Not spooked, just aware. I want to be honest with you about what I thought in that first moment. I thought it was a dog. A stray, maybe, or a big coon that gotten itself locked in when somebody closed up without looking. I reached up and worked the nail out with my folding knife, and I wasn't thinking much beyond that. Then the door swung open, and the smell hit me, sweet-rotted hay and something underneath it, something close and human, and I heard it. So faint I told myself afterward I'd almost missed it. A cough, half stifled, like a person who'd been trying for a long time not to make any noise, and the body just finally overruled them. I stood there a second. My name is Cal Briggs. I was at that point in my life, 54 years old, and I'd been a working cowhand for 36 of those years, and I'd been the sole hand on the alderman spread outside of Dunmore, Colorado, for the last 8 of them. Old Jim Alderman had died the spring before and left me the property outright, which had surprised every soul in the county more than it had surprised me, because Jim and I had talked about it over the last few years. He didn't have family. I'd kept his cattle and his buildings and his name from going to nothing for the better part of a decade, and Jim was a fair man. The ranch was mine now, not big, 83 acres, a small herd, a house with a porch that needed 2 boards replaced, but mine. I was not a man people brought their troubles to. I should say that plainly. Dunmore was a town of about 400 then, a little territorial rail stop that thought it might grow into something and mostly hadn't, and I came in for supplies every 2 weeks and spoke to the people I had business with and came back out again. I kept to myself, had for years. I don't know when that became my habit exactly, somewhere after 30, somewhere after the woman I'd planned a life with chose a man in Denver instead, somewhere in the long miles of riding for other men's outfits when you learn that your company isn't particularly required anywhere. You stop expecting to matter to people, not bitter about it mostly, just adjusted. So I was not accustomed to finding a person in my loft. I called up, said I wasn't going to hurt anybody. Stood at the bottom of the ladder with my hands open where they could be seen, if someone was looking down through the hatch. Silence for a long time, then a different sound, the soft underwater shift of hay when a person moves through it, slow and careful. A face appeared at the edge of the hatch opening. She was young, mid-20s I'd put her, dark hair that had hay in it, a lot of it. Her face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with complexion and everything to do with cold and not enough air, and there were shadows under her eyes like thumbprints in dough. One side of her jaw was swollen. Not fresh, 3 or 4 days old maybe, gone to yellow and green at the edges. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they've calculated every possible outcome for, and run out of options anyway. I said, "How long have you been up there?" She said, "Since Monday." It was Thursday. I said, "Can you climb down?" She said she thought so. She couldn't quite. Her legs had stiffened from the cold, or from being still so long, or both, and on the 3rd rung she just stopped moving and held on, and I reached up and got my hands under her arms and brought her down the last few feet like you'd handle a foal that hadn't quite found its legs. She didn't fight me, didn't have the reserves for it. I could feel the shake in her even through my coat. I set her on the ground, and she stood there swaying, and I took stock of her. She had on a calico dress that had been a decent dress once, wool stockings, shoes that were city shoes and completely wrong for anything. No coat. Her hands were gray with cold. I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Me." I said, "Okay, me, come inside." She looked at the house, looked at me. I watched her calculate again, behind her eyes, the same long arithmetic. I said, "You can stay in the barn if you'd rather, but there's a stove in the house." She came inside. I've thought about that choice of hers many times in the years since. What it cost her to walk through a strange man's door when whatever had happened to her had happened at the hands of men. I don't think I understood it fully then. I made coffee and put a blanket around her shoulders, and she sat at my kitchen table and didn't say anything for a while, just let the warmth get into her, and I didn't push. I'm not much of a talker anyway. I put biscuits on and went about my morning chores, fed the horses, broke the ice on the water trough, did the work the ranch needed. And when I came back in, she was still at the table, but the shaking had stopped, and some color had come back to her face. I sat down across from her with my own coffee and waited. She said, "You're not going to ask me." I said, "Not until you're ready to tell it." She looked at me a moment, then she said, "I was in a wagon from Kansas, 3 men, freight haulers. I'd paid them to bring me through to Pueblo where I have a sister." She stopped. Looked at her hands around the cup. They decided somewhere on the trail that they wanted something different for what they'd been paid. I didn't say anything. She said, "I got away in the night. I'd been running 2 days when I found your barn. The door was open. I hid in the loft and pulled the hay over myself and then heard horses in the yard and I didn't come down." She paused. "Someone nailed the door." I thought about that, said, "When were the horses in the yard?" She said, "Monday evening." I'd been in town that day, back after dark. I'd gone straight to bed, hadn't checked the barn. The door could have been nailed any time that night or the day after. Could have been the men looking for her. Could have been a kid from one of the neighboring properties, playing a fool trick on an empty outbuilding. Didn't matter now. I said, "Are they still looking for you?" She said, "I don't know, probably." I said, "What do you need to get to your sister in Pueblo?" She looked at me differently then. Not suspicious exactly. More like recalibrating. Like she'd been ready for the next bad thing and I'd handed her something she didn't have a category for. She said, "A way to get there." I said, "The stage comes through Dunmore on Saturdays, runs to Pueblo." I looked at her face, at the bruise, at the shape she was in. "That's 2 days. You can stay here 2 days." She said, "Why are you doing this?" I didn't have a very complicated answer. I said, "Because you need somewhere to be." She slept most of that first day. I'd put her in Jim Alderman's old room. It was the only spare room, and it had a proper lock on the inside that she could throw herself, which I told her before I left her to it. She slept with the door locked, and I heard her throw that bolt, and I went back to my own work and thought nothing of it except that it was right for her to do it. In the evening I made a meal, beans and salt pork and more biscuits. I'm not a complicated cook, and knocked and told her so and went back to the table and waited. She came out looking almost human again, if a person could look like they'd been through a hard wind for a week. She ate like someone who'd been deliberate about rationing, and was finally able to let themselves stop. We didn't talk much. I asked her the things it was useful to know, if she'd been hurt beyond what showed, if there was anything in particular she needed, if her sister knew she was coming. She answered, short answers but straight ones. She wasn't a person who softened things unnecessarily. I respected that. She asked me how long I'd had the ranch. I told her about Jim Alderman, about working his land for 8 years, about the will. She said, "So now it's yours." I said, "Now it's mine." She looked around the kitchen, at the plain walls and the plain table and the single lamp. Said, "It's a good house." I said, "It does all right." She said, "You live here alone." I said I did. She said, "Don't you get lonely?" It caught me off guard, the directness of it. Most people don't ask that. They see a solitary man in a plain house and they make their own assumptions and move on. She just asked. I said, "I've gotten used to it." She looked at me, not soft, not pitying, just clear, and said, "That's not the same as no." I didn't answer that. She was right and we both knew it, and she didn't press it, which I was grateful for. The next morning I was out at the fence line on the east pasture. One of the cedar posts had healed over in the fall freeze, and I'd been meaning to get to it, when I heard a horse on the road. 2 horses, actually, coming from the direction of town. I can't explain to you what I knew before I knew it, except that it was the same instinct as the loft door, something in the way of it sitting wrong in the air before you could name why. I set down my tools and walked back toward the house at a pace that wasn't running but wasn't slow. The horses were tied at the yard gate. 2 men were standing at my front door, and one of them had his hand raised to knock, and the other was already looking around the property in a way that wasn't casual. I came around the corner of the barn where they could see me, and I said, "Help you." They were freight men. I could tell by the cut of them, heavy shoulders, hands that didn't fit easily at their sides. the kind of weathering you get from years on a box seat in all kinds of weather. One was older, gone to gray, with a beard grown out sloppy. The other was younger, red-faced, the kind of face that doesn't give much away because there isn't much behind it to start with. The older one said they were looking for a woman, said she'd run off and taken something of theirs. I said, what would that be? He said a sum of money, a fair amount, he said. I looked at him. I'm not fast with words when I'm figuring a man out, but I'm patient, and patience in a conversation will usually shake something loose. I just waited. He said, we think she may have come through here, dark hair. About this tall, he held his hand up. I said, I haven't seen anybody like that. He said, mind if we look around? I said, I mind. Just that, not delivered loud or hard, just as a plain fact, the way you'd say the east fence needed a post. The younger one shifted his weight, and the older one did a small thing with his jaw that I read as irritation being controlled. He said, Mister. I said, Briggs, and I told you what I told you. There was a pause. The older man looked at the house, at the barn, at me. Calculating, same as me had been, but different math entirely. He was trying to decide if the trouble was worth it. I stood where I was. I was lean at 54, but I was not a small man, and I'd been doing physical work my entire life, and there are things that don't leave a person even when the years start to show. Mostly it's in how you stand. You stand like somebody who doesn't wonder about himself, and most men read that without knowing they're reading it. The younger one tried, Sheriff's gonna hear about this. I said, Dunmore Sheriff's office is 4 miles west. I'll still be here when you get back. Nothing changed in my face or my posture. They left. I stood in the yard and listened to the horses go down the road until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then I went inside. Me was standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard. I could see she'd heard from the way she was standing, slightly turned, like she'd been ready to do something and then the something hadn't been needed. She said, you didn't have to do that. I said, yes, I did. She looked at me a moment, then she said they could come back. I said they might. She said, aren't you worried? I thought about it, said, not especially. She said, why not? I said, because I've got more right to be on this land than they have to be on it, and they know it. She was quiet for a while, then she said, most men would have handed me over just to be done with it. I said, most men can do what they want. I do what I want. She looked at me for a long beat, then she said, can I help with anything? I can't just sit here and wait. I said, you know how to work cattle. She said she'd grown up on a farm in Missouri. Didn't know Colorado cattle, but she knew animals. I said, I'll show you what's different. We worked together the rest of that day. She was good with the horses, easy with them, not tentative, the kind of ease that comes from having grown up close to large animals and knowing they read your nerves. She helped me mend the section of fence I'd left unfinished in the morning, handing me staples and wire while I worked and not trying to make conversation for conversation's sake, which I appreciated more than I can say. By the time the light started going gold, she'd found her footing, and I'd stopped watching out for her the way you watch out for a person who might need catching, and had started just working alongside her the way you work alongside somebody competent. At one point, the young sorrel gelding, he was newly mine. Jim Alderman had bought him 2 months before he died, still testing the limits of everything, knocked into her sideways, and she caught his halter and said something low to him in a flat, firm tone, and he stood down. Just like that. I said, he doesn't usually take to people that fast. She said, I just told him I wasn't impressed. I laughed. I don't do it often enough that it comes easy, but it came natural then, and she looked over at me with something surprised in her face. Not the laugh exactly, more the fact of it. I said, what? She said, nothing, you should do that more. I said, what? She said, laugh. I didn't know what to say to that, so I went back to the fence and she let me, but there was something different in the air after it, something easier, like a window had been opened in a closed-up house. That night she asked me about the woman in Denver. I don't know how she knew there'd been one. Maybe she didn't exactly, maybe she was just pointing at the same thing she'd pointed at the night before, the shape of a man who'd gotten used to being alone in a way that wasn't the same as choosing it. I told her the short version. Woman named Clara Hughes, who I'd met when I was 26 and was going to marry, who'd gone back east to see family and met a man in Denver on the way back and not come back at all. Wrote me a letter. I still had it somewhere. I didn't know why I'd kept it. Some letters you keep because the burning of them feels like it would cost you something you'd miss later. Me said, how long did it take you to get over it? I said, I'm not sure I'm supposed to say. She said, that long. I said, I was young. I'd put a lot in one place. She said, that's not a fault. I said, didn't say it was, it's just how it went. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I was married. For 2 years. She said it flat, not leading anywhere specific, just laying it down on the table between us. He died. Fever. The baby died with him at the start of the same winter. That was 3 years ago. I've been in Kansas since, working for my brother-in-law, and 6 months ago he told me he expected something different for the room and board. She paused. So I paid 3 men to bring me to Pueblo. I looked at the lamp on the table. She said, I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm just telling you where I'm coming from so you know the shape of it. I said, I appreciate that. She said, I know how to work. I know how to be around animals. I know how to not bother a person who doesn't want to be bothered. She looked at her hands. I don't know what I'm going to do in Pueblo besides put myself at my sister's door and figure it out from there. I said, your sister will be glad to see you. She said, I hope so. I said, she will be. I meant it as a practical thing, but something about it landed different, and she looked at me with those clear eyes and didn't say anything for a while, and neither did I. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from worry about the freight men. They hadn't struck me as men who'd push past a refusal into something that would bring a law down on them. Cowards in the end, which is what most men who do what they'd done to me are, underneath. No, I lay awake because of a thing that had started up in me that I didn't know what to do with. 54 years old, lying on my back in my own house on my own land. And there was a woman at the other end of the hall who had walked straight through hell and come out the other side and was still square on her feet and willing to hand a man a fence staple when he needed one. And when she'd said asterisk, you should laugh more, it had landed somewhere I hadn't felt anything land in a very long time. I am not a man given to fantasy. I didn't spend the night spinning out some story. I just lay there and felt it, the particular weight of something you'd been without for so long you'd stopped noticing the absence. And now it was back, not even in any form yet, just the suggestion of it, like hearing water somewhere when you'd been in dry country for years. I was up before first light. I went out to the horses and stood in the cold gray with my hands on the top rail of the paddock fence and looked at the sky going from black to that dark washed blue and then by degrees to pink. I thought about what a man does with a thing like this, whether he says it, whether it's welcome, whether the saying of it to a woman who's had the week she's had does any good or just makes her path harder. I thought about her leaving on the Saturday stage and what the house would feel like after. I didn't decide anything. I just came back inside and made coffee and got to work. She came out of Jim's room at her usual time. She was not a person who lay abed. She'd been up and dressed and in the kitchen before I'd even thought about breakfast both mornings. And we ate together, and I told her what needed doing, and we went and did it. It was a clear, cold day, one of those November days in Colorado that are bright as a promise and sharp as a knife. She was wearing a spare coat of mine, big on her, the cuffs turned back. We worked the cattle. I was doing a final check of the herd before winter set in, noting who needed watching, making sure the water situation was sound, and she moved through the work like she'd been doing it. At one point, working the far end of the east pasture, she stopped and just looked at the mountains for a moment. I stopped too. She said, I've never seen them like this close. I said, they're different depending on where you're standing. She said, back in Missouri it's just flat, beautiful but flat. This is, she stopped, said, it's like the land has a spine. I thought about that, said, that's about right. She looked at me sideways, this small, assessing look she had. Said, did you always want to be here, in Colorado? I said, I ended up here, didn't plan it especially, started out in Texas, worked my way north over the years. This is the first place that ever felt like it was mine. Paused. Now it is. She said, you earned it. I said, Jim gave it to me. She said, and why did he give it to you? I looked at her. She said, because you earned it. I didn't say anything to that. But it settled into me somewhere, the way she said it, not soft, not complimentary in a social way, just as a simple statement of a fact she'd observed. I don't think anyone had ever said that to me that plainly. Most people looked at what Jim had left me and thought about what it meant for them, for the land values in the county, for the question of why a childless old man had left it to a hired hand instead of a relative. Nobody had said what she said, which was just the straightforward thing. I went back to work, but I felt it in the way you feel something true that you'd half stopped believing. The freight men came back in the afternoon. This time there were 3 of them. The older one, the young red-faced one, and a third I hadn't seen before, broader, slower moving, the kind of man whose size does a lot of his talking for him. They came up the road and stopped at the gate and called out, and I came out of the barn and stood in the yard. I didn't have my rifle. I want to say that plainly. I wasn't carrying, I hadn't gone to get it. I just came out with my hands free, the way I would for any caller. It mattered later what I was carrying, and it mattered that it wasn't a gun. The older one said they'd been to the sheriff. I said, and? He said the sheriff said if they had a complaint to make, he'd hear it. I said, go make it then. He said, we want the woman first. I looked at him, I looked at all 3 of them. I said, there's no woman here. The third man, the broad one, swung down from his horse. He was maybe 2 inches taller than me and 40 pounds heavier, and he walked across the yard with his chest out in the way of men who have learned that size tends to end conversations before they start. I didn't move. He stopped about 6 feet from me and said, we're going to look in that house. I said, no, you're not. He said, son, you think you're going to stop me? I said, I don't know if I can stop you. I know I'm going to try. He looked at me, the particular look of a man recalibrating, because he'd expected something to shift in my face when he got close and nothing had. And he said something low to the older man, and the older man started toward the house. I stepped sideways and cut him off. Not fast, just there, between him and the door. The older man stopped. The broad man moved up behind me. I said, I'll tell you something. You 3 drove a woman across 400 miles of open country and helped yourselves to what you wanted. I know what I know and you know what you know, and you're standing on my property without my invitation, and I am asking you to leave. The broad man's hand closed on my shoulder from behind. I turned around. He was big, like I said, but he'd spent his strength on size rather than quickness, and I'd spent mine differently, and the first 2 seconds of what happened surprised him enough that he went down harder than he'd planned for. The red-faced younger one came at me from the side, and I dealt with that, and then I was on my feet, and all 3 of them were not between me and the door anymore. I was breathing hard. My hand hurt where I'd caught his elbow wrong. I stood there in the yard and looked at them and said, get off my land. They got off my land. I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and my hand was shaking slightly, which it does sometimes after, not from fear but just from the afterburn of the body running hot. I sat and let it pass. Me was in the kitchen doorway. She said, you're bleeding. I looked at my hand. The knuckle was split not badly. I said, it'll close. She came to the table and sat across from me. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me, at my face, at my hand, with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Then she said, they're going to tell the sheriff a different story. I said, probably. She said, you should worry about that. I said, I'll tell him my story. He can sort it. She said, Cal. It was the first time she'd used my name. I noticed it the way you notice a sound in the night that's been quiet until now. She said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. I said, okay. She said, why are you doing this? I said, I told you why. She said, you told me because I needed somewhere to be. That was 2 days ago, and there have been 2 sets of men in your yard since then. She looked at me steady. You could have sent me to the sheriff. You could have let me walk to town and worked it out on my own. You have kept me in your house and put yourself between me and men who would have hurt you. I looked at the table. She said, I want to know why, the real why. I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, because no one was going to do it if I didn't, and I know how to do it, and you needed it done. She said, that's part of it. I said, yes. She said, what's the other part? I looked up at her. She was looking at me with those clear, level eyes, and there was no demand in them, no expectation, just the question, and behind the question something that looked a lot like hope. Not desperate hope. The kind of hope that's already made its own peace with the alternative, and is just asking anyway. I said, I don't know that I should say the other part to a woman who's had the week you've had. She said, what if I want you to say it? I looked at her for a long time. I said, I'd rather you got to Pueblo safe. I'd rather you had what you came out here for, your sister and a start at something decent. That's what you need. She said, I know what I need. I said, me. She said, don't manage me. I've had enough of being managed by men. I'm asking you a straight question, and I'm asking you to give me a straight answer. I said, I don't want you to go. She let that sit for a moment. I said, I'm not asking you to stay on account of that. You should go. You should get to your sister. What I want doesn't change what's right for you. She said, what if what's right for me and what you want are the same thing? I said, me. She said, I've been on this ranch 2 days. I know it's 2 days, but I've been running for 6 months, and before that I was grieving for 3 years, and before that I was building something that a fever took, and I know what this feels like. She put her hand on the table, flat, open-palmed. I know what it feels like to be in a place where I breathe right, and I know what it feels like to look at a person and know they won't make me smaller. I looked at her hand on the table. She said, I could go to Pueblo. I could be a burden on my sister while I figure out what's next. Or I could stay here, where there's work I know how to do, with a man who... She stopped. Then she said, carefully, with a man who laughed today like he hadn't in a long time and probably doesn't know his own face when that happens. I didn't say anything. She moved her hand across the table and laid it on top of mine, the one with the split knuckle. Just set it there, her hand on mine, warm and steady, not gripping, not pulling, just present. And she looked at me, straight at me, the way she looked at everything, without flinching from it, and she said, you pulled me out of a locked loft and gave me sky. Let me stay in it. I turned my hand over so my palm met hers. We sat like that a while, in the kitchen with the lamp on and the cold outside, and the mountains somewhere in the dark to the west. The sheriff came out the following morning. His name was Orrin Bell, a former army man, practical and fair. I'd dealt with him a few times over the fence disputes that are the ordinary business of any ranch, and I found him straight. He heard me first, alone in the front room, for about 30 minutes. Then he heard me. Then he went outside and stood in the yard looking at the sangers in the distance. You could see the far edge of the range from my yard on a clear day, and he thought. Then he came back in and he said, Mrs. Calloway, those men have a warrant complaint against you for theft. Me said, I took back the fare I'd paid them when I ran, because they hadn't done what I'd paid them to do. He said, I know it. He said it dry, already decided. The complaint's not going to go anywhere, not with what you've told me and what their own story has got loose in it. He looked at me. Briggs, the big one's claiming assault. I said, he put his hand on me first. He said, I know that too. He pulled on his hat. I'll send a deputy to find them and have a conversation. My strong recommendation is they're going to decide Dunmore County isn't worth the trouble. He looked at us both. That's my strong recommendation. He left. Me exhaled slowly, a long breath she'd been holding. She looked at me and I looked at her and I said, he's right, they'll go. She said, I know. I said, you could still get the Saturday stage. She said, I know that too. I said, are you? She said no. She wrote to her sister in Pueblo that weekend, told her she was all right, told her she'd found work in a decent situation and would write again soon. I didn't read the letter. I wouldn't have. But I know she wrote it because she showed me the envelope and asked if I knew the best place to mail it in town, and I told her, and she rode in with me on the Monday supply run and mailed it herself. It was a different thing, riding into Dunmore with someone beside me. I don't know how to explain it except to say that the town looked different from horseback when there was someone on the horse next to yours. People registered it. Ben Hawes at the hardware saw us come up the street and tipped his hat. Ruth Diller at the dry goods watched me come in with something bright and curious in her eyes and didn't try to hide it. There was a particular quality to the attention, not nosy, or mostly not, but interested, the way a small town is interested in anything that changes the shape of a man they've got a fixed picture of. I was not comfortable with it. I won't pretend I was. I am not a man who likes to be looked at. But me was unbothered by it. moved through the store easy, spoke to Ruth Diller pleasantly and answered what questions she chose to and didn't what she didn't, and I watched her and thought, this is a person who knows what she's walking into and has decided it's all right. That's not carelessness. That's something harder than carelessness. Riding home with the supplies loaded, she said, the woman at the dry goods was trying to figure out if I'm decent. I said, Ruth Diller tries to figure out if everybody's decent. It's her primary occupation. Me said, and what did she decide? I said, she'll decide what she decides. She said, does it matter to you what she decides? I thought about it, said, matters some. She's part of the town I live in, but not enough to change anything. She nodded, said, good. We rode in quiet for a while. The road went through a cut in the hills and out the other side into open land, and you could see the ranch from a distance at that point, the house and the barn and the paddock, small in all that space but solid, and I watched me see it. She said, it looks right. I said, it does. She said, from here it looks like it has a person in it. I looked at her. She was looking at the ranch. There was something in her face, quiet, settled, that was different from 2 days ago, different from even yesterday. The tightness was gone from around her eyes. She looked like someone who'd found firm ground after a long time in soft. I turned back to the road and let the horses walk us home. She did write to her sister again 2 weeks later. I know more of what was in it that time because she read me parts out loud in the kitchen. She told her sister about the ranch, about the cattle, about the mountains. She told her she'd found work she was good at with a man she trusted. She said she was all right in a way she hadn't been in years, and that she'd explain better when she saw her, and she hoped to see her come spring. I was washing up at the basin when she read me that last part. I didn't say anything. She folded the letter. She said, I told her about you. I said, what did you tell her? She said that you're the quietest man I've ever met and the most certain. I looked at her over my shoulder. She said, I meant it as a good thing. I said, I know you did. She said, Cal. I turned around. She was standing at the table with the folded letter in both hands, and she was looking at me with that clear-eyed look that I had come to understand was just how she saw the world, plain and true, and without much that was decorative about it. She said, I want to stay. I said, I want you to stay. She said, I mean past the winter. I mean properly. She set the letter down. I'm not asking for more than you want to give. I'm just telling you what I want so you know. Because you're the kind of man who won't say something until he's sure it's welcome, and I'm telling you it is. I crossed the kitchen. She was still and warm and there in a way that felt absolutely real, the realest thing. And I put my hands on her arms, and she leaned into me, and I held her the way I'd wanted to hold her since the day she looked at me from that loft hatch with nothing left to lose. And she put her head against my chest, and I felt her breathe out, long and slow, like a person finally putting something down that they'd been carrying too long. I said into her hair, I wasn't going to let anything happen to you. She said, I know. I said, I don't mean just those men. I didn't have the right words for it. I don't usually. I said, you were going to be all right. I was going to make sure of it. She was quiet a moment. Then she pulled back just enough to look at me, and she said, and I don't know that I'll ever forget how she said it, the straightforwardness of it, like it was simply the truth she'd arrived at. She said, you already did. We married that spring. Orrin Bell stood up with me. Me sister came up from Pueblo on the train with her husband and stayed a week, and she and me sat at my kitchen table every morning and talked the way women do when they've been separated by distance and loss and have years to make up. And I kept clear of it mostly, kept to the work. But I could hear them in the house when I was in the yard, and I found I liked the sound. The preacher from the Methodist church at the edge of town came out to do it on the porch because me didn't want to do it inside, and I had no preference. It was April, and there was still snow on the sangers, and the yard was muddy from the melt, and there were exactly 7 people present, which seemed right. He said the words, and we said ours, and when it was done, she turned to me on that porch with the mountains behind her and put her hand against my face, just her palm flat against my jaw, the way you'd steady something, and she looked at me, and the whole valley was there, the light on the peaks and the mud and the smell of it, the long work and the long silence and the freight men and the loft and all of it. And I was exactly where I was standing and exactly who I was, and she knew it, every bit of it. And she was choosing it, choosing me, not because she had no option, not because I was the only shelter going, because she looked at what was here and decided this was where she wanted to be. I don't know how to put what that felt like into words that would carry the weight of it. I'm a spare man. I've never had much language for the inside of things. But I know what it is to have been unnecessary for a long time, to move through the world as something to be looked past, to have learned to ask for nothing because asking only showed you what wasn't there, and then to have a woman put her hand against your face in the April light and make plain, without fuss, that she sees you, all of you, and that what she sees is what she wanted. I put my hand over hers. The horses were in the paddock, the cattle were on the east pasture, the house was behind us, plain and mine, and now hers. I looked at her and she looked at me, and the valley held us in its wide, cold light, and neither of us said a thing. We didn't have to.